Good morning. We are going to take a rabbit trail this morning and talk about Halloween. Tis the season, and Halloween is something that is kind of near and dear to my heart. I won't go into why this happened to me, why Halloween has become so important to me, but I will tell you that it became important enough to me that I wrote a book on the subject. It was the first book I ever wrote, and I've written a few since then. But this was the first book that I wrote, and it was called Hallowe'en, a tradition worthy of defense. It was a book for Christians, primarily for Christian pastors. However, it was designed for a general audience. I was concerned about problem that had started occurring in the Christian church regarding the insistence that Halloween was a satanic holiday, something that we should not be as Christians celebrating. My concern was that we started hearing very strange things from very credentialed sources. I heard, for instance, that if you dress up your 5-year-old as a princess and hand out candy at your front door, you're worshiping Satan. I heard no less than Chuck Smith of Calvary Chapel, who I had sat under for some 22 years, learning about the Bible. I heard him say in a video that if you carve a pumpkin and put it in your window, you're inviting Satan into your heart. My problem with that is that I knew just enough about Christianity. I knew enough about faith to understand that worship is an act of volition. Now that's a $10 word for something that you do on purpose. You cannot accidentally worship Jesus Christ. In the same way, you cannot accidentally worship Satan or anything else. So when you dress up your 5-year-old as a princess and then hand out candy at the front door, you are not worshiping Satan. You are, in fact, dressing up your 5-year-old as a princess and handing out candy at the front door. And that's all. That's it. I was concerned, though, that there were some really weird things, scary things being said about Halloween. I've put one up on the screen here. This comes from Tom McKinney in his book Holidays and Holy Days. And I'm quoting him here, it says, if we are going to obey and please God, we must have nothing to do with this pagan day of darkness. We must cleanse our lives of it all. If we want to be free, really free, we must renounce all such vestiges of hideous devil worship in the name of the Lord, no matter how innocent they may seem. Then we must call upon him to deliver us from all of the bondages and hindrances that may have come upon us as a result of such things. What I discovered as I began to research the subject of Halloween is that this and many other statements are based on a true theory. They're theories, but they're spoken as though they are facts. They are credentialed facts. And today, what we understand about Halloween in the Christian church is largely a mix of mythology. We don't have a biblical resource to look up and find out about Halloween because Halloween occurred in history after the Bible had been finished being written. It was finished being penned during the 1st century, and Halloween wasn't created until the 4th century. About 327 is when this started coming about, and I'll explain that in just a second. Also based on a true theory is Jim Willoughby. He's a pastor in Ontario, California. He wrote a book called Trick or Treat, Satan's Game. And he says, one parent recently came to me and said, I don't know what to do. When I told my little boy he wouldn't be going trick-or-treating, he threw a fit. I, that is Jim Willoughby, asked, how old is your son? And she said, 8. Well, that person had a serious problem. It appeared that the 8-year-old child was running the home instead of the parent. If all of their friends go to hell, are you going to let your child go with them? And then he goes on to explain why you are going to hell if you celebrate Halloween. If you send your 5-year-old out into the streets to get candy, you're going to hell. It's like every year it gets worse and worse and worse. So in 1996, that's when I published the first book, I started making radio appearances. I did a lot of work on the radio, and I did a lot of talking, and many of those were call-in programs. And boy, if you don't think that the weirdos, I'm talking about Richard here, the weirdos come out of the woodwork and make phone calls to the station asking some really strange questions. I came to the conclusion, frankly, that people will believe what they want to believe. And there's a lot of truth in that statement. So I'm not here to convince any of you one way or the other about Halloween. What I'm trying to do this morning, and what I have tried to do ever since the book came out many years ago, what I'm trying to do is present the facts as facts and the theories as theories. And then you can make up your own mind about what constitutes Halloween, what Halloween really is and what it really isn't, based on those theories. So this morning we're going to talk about Halloween, and specifically, as I said, I'm going to focus on the facts and the theories of Halloween, and that's kind of the outline that I wanted to present. I want to show you what the facts of history are. Again, I can't take you to a biblical resource, although we'll do that a little bit later anyway. Because the Bible doesn't include any mention of Halloween or trick-or-treating or any of those other things. These all happened in history hundreds of years after the Bible was finished being penned. This is important. That little apostrophe between the E's in Halloween is the key to understanding the facts and the theories. Halloween is a contraction. We don't usually see it that way, but properly spelled, there is an apostrophe between the two E's. You'll find this in many of the dictionaries that were written before 1900. Webster's dictionary has it this way, the one that he originally put out back in the 1800s. About the time of the Civil War. It has the apostrophe, and many older works do also have the apostrophe. The reason that there's an apostrophe in any word is because it's a contraction. It's actually two words that have been put together, and the apostrophe is the dividing line between the two of them. And so American slang kicks in, and we kind of push them together and make them one word, but we always remember that they are representing two words by where the apostrophe occurs. An example of this would be, for instance, can't. Huh? We're, can't. The apostrophe goes before the T at the end, representing the N-O that's missing. You know what I'm saying? It's missing that. It was two words. We took out the N-O of not. So we took the can, pushed the T up against it, and put the apostrophe in for the missing letters. You see how that works? That's a contraction. So we say can't, and that's the same thing as saying cannot. We're, as opposed to we are, and same thing. We put the apostrophe in where the missing letter is occurred. That's what Halloween is all about. Wouldn't you like to know what's missing? Because nobody does. We haven't talked about what's missing from Halloween, what the missing letters were, what the two words were that came together to form Halloween. We haven't talked about that in almost 60, maybe 70 years, because it's not in any of our contemporary works on the subject of Halloween. The missing word starts with EV. It actually is preceded by the. This is the hallowed evening. Hallowed evening became contracted to Halloween by removing the EV and putting the apostrophe where they were missing. So Halloween really is a contraction of the word, the phrase, the hallowed evening. The word hallowed, which is the same as the word holy, on the front of our Bibles, the Holy Bible, is an indication that this is set apart. Set apart. Doesn't mean, holy does not mean what you think it means. Holy does not mean that it's righteous, it's pure, it's good, it's all of these things. It may be all of those things, especially when applied to the Bible. However, what holy really means is that it is set apart from all other things like it. The Christian church, the early Christian church, and this is a spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you now and then I'm going to go ahead and prove it to you. Halloween was invented by the Christian church. It is not only of Christian origins, it is on the Christian calendar the second most important day, holiday, on the Christian calendar. It's only Easter was considered more important back in the day. Halloween is a Christian holiday. In fact, it is the Memorial Day of the Christian church. Now, we all know about Memorial Days. Memorial Day is when we celebrate. We have 2 days like this. One's called Veterans Day and one's called Memorial Day, right? And Memorial Day is different from Veterans Day. They're both talking about soldiers that went out to fight. Veterans are those that came back alive. And we celebrate those on Veterans Day. The ones that died in battle, we celebrate on Memorial Day. And that's what the Christian church decided to do. They decided to establish a Memorial Day for something that took 300 years out of our history and nobody remembers because we have forgotten the Memorial Day of the Christian church, Halloween. And today we have Christian pastors calling it all kinds of terrible things, satanic day and all the rest of this, because it's a day of the dead, a day of the dead. And it is. It's a celebration of the dead. Christians that died at the hands of the great Christian persecution. Everybody talks about the Holocaust. And when you say the word Holocaust, you might remember that there were 4 million Jews that were brutally killed or put into gas chambers and killed in mass, buried in mass graves during World War II by Nazi Germany. 4 million men, women, and it was a horrible catastrophe, no doubt. But we remember that because people are still talking about it. There are memorial days established, and there are sites where you can go and you can see these things and pictures of the horrible atrocities that were committed against the Jews. What you don't hear about is the Great Holocaust, what they used to call the Great Holocaust of history. The Great Holocaust was a Christian Holocaust, not a Jewish one, where the Christian church was being persecuted first by the Jews and then ultimately by Rome, the Roman government. 8 million men, women, and children were horribly tortured for weeks on end in an attempt to get them to recant the name of Jesus. Recant the name of Jesus and we'll turn you loose. 8 million men, women, and children refused to recant the name, and they went to their ultimate deaths in the Colosseum or in Nero's circus, and we'll get to those things momentarily. But this was a horrible time in our history. We want to talk about the facts, first of all, and this great Christian Holocaust was where Peter, for instance, which we know from Scripture, he's the big guy. Whenever all of the disciples are mentioned in the New Testament, Peter is always listed first. He was the big fisherman that more often than not put his foot in his mouth when he was talking to people. But he was the one, the big guy, and Peter was crucified. When he went to his death, and by the way, he was crucified in Nero's circus. Nero's circus was the name applied to a place where they held games to entertain the public, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Peter was crucified, but when he went to the cross, he said, "I'm not worthy to die as my Lord has. So crucify me, but crucify me upside down." And so he was crucified upside down. And this is a part of history. We know this to be a fact. But it was because he was the first of the disciples that was so killed by the Roman government for being a Christian. And because of that, his cross was considered the logo, if you want to think of it that way, the logo of the Martyrs' Day that came about as a result of this. And so when they wanted to symbolize the martyrs of Christianity, they used the upside-down cross. Think about that for a second. Today, if you see an upside-down cross, what do people think it means? Something satanic. And it doesn't. It doesn't. It never did. The only people who believe this are the Satanists. And where did they get the idea for the upside-down cross? From the Christians. Most of Satanism, what we call Satanism today, the Church of Satan, most of the things that they do are taken from the Bible. They do them backwards or upside down or anything else. We should be revering the upside-down cross because that's the symbol of the Christian martyrdom that started so long ago. Peter was crucified. Matthew, the penman of the first gospel, he was impaled. He was run through with a spear, and he died with the spear in him. Paul was beheaded. James, who was not only the penman of James in our New Testament, but also the half-brother of Jesus, James was beaten to death. Mark, author or penman rather of the Gospel of Mark, he was burned alive at the stake. Ignatius was torn by beasts, and the list goes on and on and on and on. And there were a total of some 8 million men, women, and children, almost twice as many as the Nazi Holocaust of Germany against the Jews. But we don't remember this because we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater by getting rid of Halloween and calling it a satanic holiday rather than the very Christian holiday that it is. The great Christian Holocaust began with the crucifixion of Jesus, as is obvious from Scripture, but it went on through the first and second and third centuries. It was finally put to a halt in the year 327. The Roman emperors became progressively more anti-Christian as the years went by. And their persecution of Christians anywhere that they could find them became much more intense and bloody. There are horrible, horrible stories given to us in the collected works that we call Fox's Book of Martyrs. This has come down to us from a time long, long ago. And these are the recorded bits and snippets of recorded history from the church as well as from the Roman government about the people and what was done to them because they refused to recant the name of Jesus. Not one soul during this entire time is recorded as ever having recanted the name of Jesus. All of them gave up their lives to beasts, to gladiators, to crosses, to all kinds of horrible deaths. With a smile on their face, they knew where they were going. And death held no problems for them. They just had to get through it and past it because what was on the other side was far more glorious than anything in this life and whatever it promises. So it started about the time of Christ's crucifixion, and it lasted until about the year 327 AD. In 327, something happened that changed the course of human history. I can say that with some credential because what happened in all of this was a series of things that all came together in a miraculous, that's the only way to say it, a miraculous change in the entire Roman system of government, which was the worldwide empire at the time. A new emperor came to power. His name was Constantine, and everybody knew that he was kind of a rough and tumble kind of a character. Everybody anticipated that he would be far worse than all of those that came before him. And so with a sneer on his face and an angry look, he presented himself to his senators and the other Caesars and took the Roman emperorship. And shortly thereafter, and recorded sources are kind of confused on this subject, they had no idea what was about to happen. He stood up in the Senate and proclaimed, and I'm giving you the Cliff's Notes version here. This is the paraphrased version. He proclaimed that the Roman system of gods and goddesses were myths. They were nothing. They were pagan deities, and they were no longer allowed to be worshipped by any Roman citizen anywhere in the world. There was only one God, his name is Jehovah, and his son died on a cross in Palestine for your sins. And then he ordered the release of all Christians who were being held in jails all over the empire, all over the world, awaiting torture and death. The Christians who were hiding at the time thought sure that this was a trick to bring them out of hiding so that they could be captured and thrown in jail. But it took about 50 years for people to realize that this was true. His name was Constantine, and he changed the world. Following that 50 years, the state religion of Rome became Christianity, and it has been ever since. No other gods or goddesses were ever allowed to be worshipped in Rome or in any of the Roman Empire thereafter. It was only Jesus Christ and Jehovah the Father. So, huge change. To give you a summary, the Christians faced worldwide annihilation at the hands of their enemies. The new emperor was secretly one of them. He had been raised as a Christian by his mother, secretly, because it was forbidden to worship God or Jesus. Only the Roman gods were allowed to be worshipped when he was growing up. But his mother secretly taught him about God and secretly taught him about Jesus and the Bible and all the rest of this stuff. So he grew up as a secret Christian. Shh, don't tell anybody. Raised from childhood to hide his faith in a hostile world, rising to power, the secret was dramatically revealed. I mean, he couldn't have made it more dramatic. He purposely did it in such a way to shock the entire world. The Holocaust was reversed by a single proclamation. Everybody that was in jail is now free. And those of you who are not Christians, we're going to start looking at you very, very seriously. The oppressed came to rule over their oppressors. Now, I'm going slow with this because this is going to come up again later in a surprisingly dramatic way. There was great rejoicing and giving to the poor. That's how the Christians celebrated this new freedom that they had found. And ultimately, many became Christians simply because of their fear of reprisals. You can imagine. If you had been worshiping Zeus all your life and suddenly the Christians came to power, you might be tempted to proclaim Jesus as your Lord and Savior just because you didn't want any reprisals by either the government or other people in the empire because you were still secretly worshiping Zeus or one of the Roman gods. So many people became Christians simply because they were afraid of reprisals, not because they necessarily believed in Jesus or in God, in Jehovah. Ultimately, a memorial day was instituted. Shortly after this happened, the church got together and they decided that it was going to be, it's an interesting fact of history, that the Council of Nicaea was formed. This was the first council of the churches after this Christian Holocaust was over. And there was one man who championed celebrations. That was his thing. He was considered a celebration kind of a guy, and he sponsored the Nativity. At the time, they didn't call it Christmas. He sponsored the Nativity as a church-wide holy day, and won through the council. And so it was put on the calendar as among the very first. That, of course, and Easter. And he also suggested that they celebrate a Memorial Day. It was originally called Martyrs' Day. Martyrs' Day. And that was the Memorial Day to remember those who had been killed during this 300-year long persecution, this Holocaust of the Christians. So the Martyrs' Day was established, and it was established on May 13th and 14th. And the reason we're given here from the Encyclopedia Britannica. By the way, I'm giving references here. This is not just what I'm saying. This is what the books, the history books that were written at the time tell us. In the English, it's easier for us to understand things like the Encyclopedia Britannica and the Compton's and World Book encyclopedias and what they have to say about this. So I've replicated them here on the screen. One of the things that I noticed about all of the authors that are speaking negatively against Halloween is that they never provide any sources. They never have any footnotes. They never say, well, we know that the Druids were responsible because so-and-so wrote this way back when. There's nothing about this. And as we will see, this is a very dangerous way to propagate the same story through telling it and retelling it across the years. In the Encyclopedia Britannica, it tells us that in the late 4th century, that's late 300s, in the late 4th century, a feast of all martyrs, that's what they called it, all martyrs, was observed by the Eastern Syrians on May 13th and 14th, and by the Western Syrians and Byzantines on the Sunday following Pentecost, which is roughly the same time. It's just a matter of being identified with the date as opposed to with the Sunday following Pentecost. Pentecost is something that not all Christians celebrate, but they probably should. The Jews referred to it as Shavuot, which is a Hebrew word that we're largely unfamiliar with. I try to go through Shavuot about once every other year, but that's neither here nor there. That's another sermon. Pope Boniface IV received from Emperor Phocas the Pantheon at Rome, which was dedicated on May 13th to Mary and all martyrs. Now, don't worry so much about the Mary reference here or the all martyrs. The idea is that the dedication of this pantheon, the pantheon was a unique structure in Roman history. They called it the pantheon because it was the temple of all gods. All of the gods, they had statues of all of the gods, and they had all kinds of, and so they rededicated the whole thing, and now it was going to be a Christian church. And the irony of this wasn't lost on the Christians. So a lot of them decided that they were going to celebrate their All Martyrs' Day on this particular day, this 13th and 14th. And I have to explain the 13th and 14th because it's a key to understanding what happens next. Halloween is not, hear me, Halloween is not celebrated on the 31st day of October. It is not. It is celebrated on November 1st. We all celebrated on November 1st. The difference isn't the date so much as it is the way that the day is described in ancient history. Christians until about 200-300 years ago, and Jews for thousands of years, have considered the day as beginning with dusk. Okay? Tonight, at dusk, we're going to see what we call Sunday night tonight, right? Sunday night. The Jews will call Monday night, because the night always comes before the day in any 24-hour period of time. The day, or the day of Monday, will begin with Monday night and end with Monday afternoon. You see how their day runs? This isn't because they're weird people. They are, don't misunderstand me, but it isn't because they're weird or superstitious or anything else. It's because God created them that way in Genesis chapter 1. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And the evening and the morning were the second day, and so forth. That's the way that God created them. And so the Jews stick with that. The Christians did until about 300 years ago, and they decided to follow the rest of the world. And now we divide the day at midnight, or we say we do. I got up, early this morning, and I considered this early morning on Sunday. But we really think of it in different terms by saying the dark last night, that was Saturday night, right? And Sunday really begins daylight on Sunday and lasts through the evening. We have this variable idea about when our day starts and ends. Not so with the Jews. At dusk, and they know precisely what time it is, that twilight time between the day and the dark. They know exactly what time it is to the minute because they're required to light candles at that specific moment in time, especially on the Sabbath day, which begins on what you and I would think of as Friday night. Friday night. Now, the reason that this is important, you may be wondering why. The reason that this is important is because November 1st begins with the night before. You see where I'm going with this? Christmas is celebrated on the 25th day of December, and rightfully so. But what we call Christmas Eve is not the 24th, it's the evening of Christmas, which appears on the Jewish calendar as well as on the old Christian calendars on the evening before the day of Christmas. So it's always considered the 25th of December. It's just the beginning of the 25th of December, which happens the night before. You see how that works? That's why they call it Christmas Eve, short for evening. New Year's Eve does the same thing. So does the hallowed day begin with the evening, and that's contracted to what we think of as Halloween. Okay, enough said. Let's continue here. All Martyrs' Day begins with the conclusion, and it's symbolized by the upside-down cross, because that was the first big martyrdom publicly of Peter, the first of the disciples. Then come church pageants. Now this is kind of fun. This comes from Hallowe'en and Satanism. This guy is an author against Halloween. He says on All Hallows, which is November 1st, remember, and the evening before, specifically, the evening before. On All Hallows, many churches staged plays that they called pageants. Now, don't get hung up on the English terms here. There were corresponding terms in different languages for this. Pageants, for the benefit of their members. Each pageant participant was dressed up as the patron saint of his special guardian. Matthew, Peter, Paul, whatever. You picked one of the martyrs and you dressed up as that martyr. And you got to go, but when you dressed up like Paul, you arrived without your head. It's kind of like being the headless horseman. If you were dressed up like Matthew, you dressed up with a spear run through you. They did this to dramatically illustrate the deaths, how they died as martyrs, because they were celebrating their martyrdom. Not their lives, but their martyrdom. That's what the Memorial Day was all about. So it's interesting that those who did not play the part of a holy one, is what they called it, played the part of devils or demons or witches or something like that. The procession then marched from the church out to the churchyard where the play might continue until late in the evening. That is, late in the evening on the following day, which would have been the following day. It's interesting that, to continue here, they would walk, and remember, this isn't me saying this. This is an author talking about the history of the church at this time. They would walk door to door begging for food for the poor. If this sounds vaguely familiar, it should. This is facts. These are facts. This isn't, I haven't gotten to the theories yet. They would walk door to door begging food for the poor, chanting, "Soul, soul for a soul cake. I pray, good mistress, for a soul cake." Soul cake was a currant style bun. It was a sweet, sticky bun that the shops were full of at this time of the year. And so when they'd come to the door, and it's kind of like carolers, they'd come in a group and give us some sticky buns, give us a soul cake, an apple or a pear or a plum or a cherry, any good thing to make us merry. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, 3 for him who made us all. Up with the kettle, down with the pan, give us good alms and we'll be gone. They didn't do much for rhyming back then. It didn't exactly rhyme the way maybe they said it with a different, maybe it was the Gaelic in there that made it rhyme or something. Anyway, church pageants occurs a couple hundred years after All Martyrs' Day started being celebrated. And then, interestingly, the first evidence for the November 1st celebration. Remember that the original Martyrs' Day celebration happened on the 13th and the 14th. This is a very important combination of days. They would start on the 13th the same way we would start Halloween on the 31st. It was the evening before the 14th. You see how that works? So we call it the 13th and the 14th. They celebrated this. The first real evidence for a November 1st celebration and the broadening of the old festival, All Martyrs' Day, to All Saints as well as martyrs, occurred during the reign of Pope Gregory III, who dedicated a chapel in St. Peter's, Rome on November 1st, AD 737, in honor of all saints. Now, I've got to add something to Encyclopedia Britannica here. This is, you might not catch this from, unless you're a good Catholic. This church that he says, Pope Gregory's, who dedicated a chapel in St. Peter's, Rome on November 1st, the chapel that he dedicated is called today the Basilica of Peter, or St. Peter's Basilica. It's not just a chapel, it's a huge church. And the church is made bigger by the fact that it is not just huge in and of itself, but it's got a warehouse, both underground and above ground, where they would store relics. So Basilica is this huge thing in the Vatican today, where and it's been rebuilt since then, but this was where they started gathering artifacts of the different saints that had died previously. When a saint would die, in a saint that had been living a holy man, say, I don't know, Saint Michael. Okay, if you were in a town and Saint Michael was a bishop here, and he was going to be, he was Saint Michael, but he died here, then you would remember him with his own day. Okay, the day that he died would be his death day. That's how you would celebrate his death. They didn't really celebrate birthdays back then. They celebrated death days, and that was how they remembered these things. And so you would remember him, but only in this town, because this is where he died. So this town would remember St. Michael on his death day. And they would gather together all of the artifacts of his office and the things that he did during this time, the things that he used every day, and the clothes that he wore, and maybe the crown that he wore, and the staff that he used, and all of these different things. They'd gather these things together, and they'd put them in a church, a chapel there in that town. The problem was that there were so many towns and so many cities scattered all through the world where this was happening that there suddenly became many, 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 many more saints than there were days in the calendar year. And this became a real problem for the Catholic Church at the time, because on any given day, different cities would be celebrating different death days of different saints. So they decided to fix all of this. They would establish one place in the entire world where you could bring all of the artifacts of all of the dead saints and martyrs and put them in a big chapel that was dedicated as a warehouse also. And all of these artifacts could be in one place. And then we could celebrate all of them on a single day, and we'd call it All Saints' Day. That was the purpose behind the establishment of All Saints' Day. In 837, Pope Gregory IV ordered its general observance. In medieval England, the festival became known as All Hallows because it was all of the holy people that were being celebrated. And its eve is still known as Halloween. I'm not saying this is the Encyclopedia Britannica. Halloween was the ultimate evolution, if you want to think of it like this, of first All Martyrs' Day, then All Saints' Day, and ultimately the Holy Day. And they called it the Holy Day because it was the one and only day that everybody celebrated. Even if you missed Easter, you had to celebrate the Holy Day, the hallowed day. And that started with the hallowed evening, Halloween. And we've forgotten it. And today, because there's a vacuum there and nobody knows what it means, we've decided to ascribe all of it to Satan. What a tragedy. It's interesting that this is Nero's circus. This chapel that was dedicated on November 1st was a significant deal, big deal for the early Christian church. The 737 dedication was on the ruins, the foundation, if you will, of Nero's circus. Remember I said I'd talk more about that? They took the place that had formerly been used to kill 8 million Christians in a wide variety of different ways. Everything from being torn up by beasts to being slaughtered by gladiators and hung and crucified and burnt to death, and all of these horrible things. These were all done in this place, this Nero's circus, as well as the fighting of the gladiators with each other, horse races and all kinds of things. Because it had been used to kill so many Christians and was now going to be dedicated as a chapel to Jesus Christ, the irony was not lost. And so once again, Christians all over the known world decided to move their original All Martyrs' Day and now All Saints' Day celebrations to November 1st, the day of the year that the basilica came into existence on the foundation of the old place of torture and killing of the Christians. So it was fitting that they would celebrate the Memorial Day on November 1st, the day that this was all going to happen. And they did. They started celebrating their now what they called All Saints' Day and ultimately what would be called Halloween on November 1st because of this Nero circus being repurposed as a Christian church, as the Christian church, and the place where all of the artifacts were gathered into the warehouse. This is what St. Peter's Basilica looks like after they rebuilt it as a chapel instead of the old ruined circus, the old ruined Colosseum-like kind of a thing. And I won't go into the details except to say that the hallowed evening became the general purpose name all over the empire about 950 AD. 950 is when we started calling it that. Okay. World Book Encyclopedia says All Saints' Day is a holy day observed by many Christians on November 1st. It honors all Christian saints, especially those who do not have days named for them. It was celebrated first on May 13th to 14th in either AD 609 or 610, when the Emperor Phocas gave an ancient Roman temple called the Pantheon to Pope Boniface IV as a church. The feast was extended to commemorate all saints, in addition to those who had been given their lives for the faith. Halloween takes its name from All Saints' Day because October 31st was called All Hallows' Eve, the eve of the Holy One's Day. So this is what I was explaining earlier, but this is what World Book Encyclopedia says about it. Okay, the hallmarks of this day, just to review now, is that the church established this originally on May 13th and 14th, and then much later on, hundreds of years later, they changed it to November 1st because of the dedication of the circus into St. Peter's Basilica. But it originally started on May 13th and 14th. The people wore costumes. They dressed up like saints, or devils, or witches, or Caesars, or Roman soldiers, all of the bad guys. It's interesting, when you do a study of these pageants that the churches held, there was one thing in common that they all had. Not who you dressed up as or what the costumes were all about, but as the stories were told, it became very common for the Christians in the audience, who were also dressed up, by the way. Everybody came in costume, not just the players. But it became important for some reason, and scholars are still kind of upset that they don't know the reason for this, but all over the world, for some reason, Christians, as they watched the plays that were reenacted during the pageants, they would cheer out loud and loudly. They would cheer for the good guys, and guess what they would do when the bad guys came on? And we thought that up. That was, that's part of Dudley Do-Right and Snidely Whiplash. And whenever they would talk, in fact, whenever the bad guys would say something in the pageant, then everybody would boo and hiss so you couldn't hear the bad guys. It was like a game, if the bad guy opened it, and they did this too. A lot of times the bad guy would open his mouth as if to say something, and then everybody would boo, and when they stopped, then he'd quickly say what it is he was going to say. And so it became kind of a contest. You had to watch their mouths, and you had to boo to blot out what it is that he was saying. But this happened all over in kind of all synchronized at the same time all over the world. And scholars are confused about why this happened. I'm going to tell you this morning how it happened, with credential and with history. Now, this is really cool. So they came in costumes. After the pageants, they went door to door, and they did a thing called trick or treat. Now, we call it trick or treat today. Back then, they were gathering food for the poor. A lot of high-spirited young men decided to, if somebody didn't give to the poor like they should when they approached the front door, they decided to, kick over a pot or two on the way out in retribution for them not giving to the poor. And this began what we think of today as trick or treat. But again, this happened long before we got into this Satanism thing. The church did this. The results of this trick or treat then were given to the poor. That was the target of all of this, to give to the poor. Now, the theories. What you should know is that the theories are theories not about who started the day, not about what day it's celebrated on, nor about the intent of the founders of Halloween for what it is that they were supposed to be celebrating. This has all become very confusing in the intervening years, but facts are facts, folks. The Christians started Halloween as Martyrs' Day, and it evolved through All Saints' Day until finally it became Halloween. The Satanists, the Druids, the Celtics, they had nothing to do with any of this. These are facts of history so far. Now, there are theories that are disputed. Lots of arguing going on about Halloween and who had anything to do with it. But these are not about who started the day, nor why they started the day. So the who and the why are established as facts of history. No doubt about it. But the controversy about Halloween remains about the symbols of the day. Where did the Christians get their symbols? They went door to door, collecting for the poor. But did they think this all up by themselves, or did they borrow this from somebody else? They dressed up in costumes. We got that. But was that because they thought that up themselves, or whether they got that from somebody else? They celebrated on November 1st. But was that really their idea, or did they do this for some other more nefarious purpose? Were they copying Satanists someplace? Those are the controversies in the church today about Halloween. And they all think that it's the Druids. Now, let me tell you first of all, there are three theories. The first theory is, yeah, they did. They thought it all up themselves. They thought it up, the costumes. They thought up the trick-or-treat. They thought up the giving to the poor. They thought up the November 1st. All of this stuff the church thought up. Most historians are convinced that that's not the case, because these things came into history fully formed. There was no evolution. They just poof, appeared all over the world in all of the Christian churches. So they had to get it from somebody else. The second theory is that they borrowed these symbols, trick or treat, giving to the poor, dressing up in costumes, all of that stuff, the symbols of the day rather than what they were celebrating on the day. They got these things from somebody else. And the second theory is they got these things, they borrowed these things from a wicked and perverse people among the Celts of Europe long, long ago. The Celts had a ruling body over them called the Druids. And we're going to talk about the Druids for just a minute. This is a Celtic warrior and his wife. This is a museum piece. And they were located in this part of Europe, a little bit in France, but mostly in the British Isles and Ireland way back when. And I'm going to show you a timeline here in just a second. The timeline here is specifically about these Druids. Now, this is from Encyclopedia Americana. The only specific reference to Druids encountered by the Romans when they invaded Britain is in connection with the assault on Mona in Angsley in 61 AD. So the Druids were never seen by the outside world until 61 AD. Now, they may have existed a few years before that, but nobody had ever heard of, let alone seen, a Druid in the outside world until 61 AD. You see that? So I'm going to put a marker on the timeline right there, 61 AD. That's when the Druids came into play, 61 AD. The next one is from the Academic American Encyclopedia. The Druids' fierce resistance to the spread of the Latin, that is, the Roman culture, led to their suppression by Roman authorities in Britain and Gaul. In Ireland, which never came under Roman rule, Druidism survived until AD 500. And I put a marker there. So between AD 61 and AD 500, the Druids existed as far as the outside world was concerned. Are there Druids today? Well, to be fair, there have been several attempts to reestablish or restart the old extinct cult. The problem is there are no records. There are no records of what the Druids did, what they practiced. There are no records, and I'll show you why here in just a second. The Druids then lived for 439 years on the timeline. You can see where they lived relative to what the church was doing with Hallowe'en in the interim. The Christians began celebrating a November 1st All Saints' Day in 737. The Druids became extinct in AD 500. That means that there were no Druids to copy. They hadn't existed for 237 years at the time that the church decided on a November 1st celebration. So they could not have gotten it from them. Some people will say, but what about the history of the Druids as preserved by the Celts? Wouldn't that have influenced the church, potentially? Well, let's look at that. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, little is known of the doctrines of the Druids. Now, how can little be known? Well, little is known of the Druids, according to Colton's encyclopedia, because their rites were never written down. It's not that they were negligent about writing this down. Neither the Druids nor the Celts had a written language. They had no alphabet. They couldn't write anything down. No early Celtic literature has been preserved. The Druids did not commit their learning to writing. Folks, anything that some Christian author or pastor says about how the Druids did things, the evil, wicked things that the Druids did, they worshipped oak trees, they prayed to the spirits in the bark of the oak trees. They went door to door with pots of lit human fat, and they gathered virgins for sacrifice at the doors of. I mean, you hear horrible things like this, and they get horrible every year that they're told. I've read some of these accounts, and they're all fiction. None of it ever happened. And you can say that with credential because the Druids became extinct in 500 AD, and there were no written histories of what they did at the time. In fact, that the Druids offered sacrifices to their deity, there can be no doubt. But there is some uncertainty as to what they offered, and of the ceremonies connected with their religious services, we know almost nothing. It is certain that they committed nothing of their doctrines to writing or to history, or their poetry for that matter. Their teaching was oral, and their literature, if such a word may be used in such a case, was preserved solely by oral tradition. Now, I don't know if you've ever done this before. When I was in school, and that was a long, long time ago, we used to play a game called telephone. Any of you ever played telephone? What happens for those of you who have little or no education in these important matters? What happens is you whisper a short one-sentence message to the person next to you. Nobody else hears that. And then that person turns to the person next to them and whispers the same exact message to the person next to them. And it's got to be exact every time you whisper it. So it goes in secret, whispered around the circle, and by the time it gets to the back, then what you do is you have the last person stand up and say out loud what was whispered to them. And then you have the first person stand up next to them and say out loud what was originally given to them, how it started. And there is absolutely no comparison between the two. Everybody was given the same task exactly as it was whispered to you. But between the beginning and the end, elephants came into play. I mean, it's weird how an oral tradition can change with the telling. A contemporary version of oral tradition is the fish story you tell about the trout that you caught, right? This trout that you could have measured with one hand, and suddenly it's become the monster of the lake kind of a thing. Every time you tell the story, the fish gets bigger. You've heard this before. Well, this is what happened with them, only it wasn't just the retelling of this fish story over the course of, say, 10 years. This went on for 700 years. 700 years. The ancient Celts did not write down their history and religion and poetry. Literature written in the Celtic language did not begin to grow up until much later. The earliest Celtic literature was written about 1200 AD. Now remember, the Druids died out in 500 AD. There were no Druids to write a history about. And the people who had lived with the Druids had long since died. It was over 700 years later that somebody thought, okay, now we've got a written language, let's write down what those Druids did back then. And what they wrote was fantastical. Dogs, or toads the size of dogs that would come to your front door, followed by an emaciated, a pale man, and they would steal your daughters and take them away to be human sacrifices, and ridiculous things. But there was nobody to question it because they were the Celts. The Druids grew up with the Celts. But what's lost in the whole conversation is the fact that this was the fish story that had been being retold over campfires for the last 700 years. And it had been that long since there was a Druid. Christianity finally comes to the Celts approximately 1050 AD. Christianity comes to the Celts. Now, it's reasonable to assume that before 1000, the Christians didn't know anything about the Druids, let alone about the Celts. And the Celts didn't know anything about the Christians either. Christianity came in the form of monks that traveled into the Irish and the British realms and started teaching about Jesus Christ. And a lot of Celtic people switched from Samhain, or Samhain, which is how they pronounced it, Samhain, this god, this warrior god that they had been celebrating, and went to Christianity. This happened in such droves that the monks were responsible for helping over the next 100 years these Celtic people to form their own written language. The language that they were speaking at the time had no written counterpart, so it was all an oral kind of a thing. The Druids write their history up here in 1200 AD. I'm sorry, the Celts write the Druids' history 700 years after the last Druid dies out. It's reasonable to assume that no one living at the time that it was written, finally, on paper, was alive to see or experience the Druids. It's been 700 years. So for 700 years, they had been playing telephone with the history of the Druids. It's unreasonable to assume that anybody during the 7-year period, it's unreasonable to assume that anybody in the next 30 minutes could pass on the message exactly the way that they heard it in a game of telephone in a classroom. So give it 700 years and you can see how wild that got. Plus, it wasn't just a matter of trying to scare the little ones or be wild about it. They had their national integrity to protect. So they made themselves important by changing their own history. We call this today, we call this revisionist history. And a lot of cultures are guilty of this. If you go to Russia, for instance, and ask them about the Second World War, they'll have no idea what it is that you're talking about. They've never heard of the Second World War in Russia. Instead, they teach their children about the Great War of the Fatherland. That is the Russian war against Germany. And boy, it's a good thing that Russia was there because Germany was a threat to the whole world. And the good news is Russia prevailed over the Germans. No mention of the Americans is ever made. That's called revisionist history. Of course, we're just as bad about that in the United States. We do the same thing. There is not a single source for this kind of information, and so it's up to the national integrity to build their own histories, and they tend to do this with wild abandon. Stonehenge is a good example about what I'm coming to, and I'm going to focus for just a minute on November 1st. November 1st. Samhain, the Vigil of Samhain is what it was called, or Samhain as they probably pronounced it back then. The Vigil of Samhain was celebrated on a specific day. It was not November 1st. Not November 1st. The Celtic people did not have a written language. They were fairly barbaric people. They didn't have a lot of science or sophistication. They were kind of like native Indians, if you will, in the United States centuries later. So the Celts were fighting against the Roman Empire that was advancing and trying to overthrow them and take them into the Roman Empire. So the Romans were the bad guys. The Celtic people did not have their own calendar. There was no calendar that they marked the days off of. They didn't say, today is November 1st. They knew about the Roman calendar, but the Romans were their enemies, right? So they aren't going to adopt the Roman calendar and say, we're going to celebrate on November 1st. They had the sun. And a lot of people think that's what Stonehenge is all about. And you can go there today in the British Isles and visit Stonehenge. It's a series of huge rocks that are set up, and the ruin of them is still there. A lot of people have debated about what the purpose for these rocks was. The only thing they can agree on is that some really interesting coincidences occur 2 or 3 times a year. And one of those coincidences occurs at the autumnal equinox. Now, the autumnal equinox is that day in the year where the days and the nights are equally as long. I mean, it's halfway between the winter and the summer as far as the length of the days occurs. So their autumnal equinox was a big thing to a lot of cultures throughout the world, a lot of primitive cultures. The Celts watched this, and Stonehenge is probably a good example. On September 22nd, the autumnal equinox occurred, and on that day at sunrise, you could see the sun appear in a direct line through all of these stones, in that white line there. So it was a big deal. And it's one of the coincidences, well, most scholars don't believe it's a coincidence. They think that's the reason that it was built, to identify that day in the year where the sun went right. These are things like Indiana Jones would be seeing. You know what I mean? It's a you know, on the you know what I'm talking about. That thing, yeah, that thing. This is a picture on September 22nd of the sun going through all of these holes in all of the structures and appearing on the other side. So it was a big deal back then, and it's a big deal today. And they think that Samhain, the vigil of Samhain, was originally celebrated on September 22nd. And most scholars agree on this, although some dispute this. They think it was celebrated in the spring, the vigil was. But most scholars agree that it was probably on September 22nd. Today, the Irish peoples in particular, but a lot of people in Britain too, will celebrate the vigil of Samhain on November 1st. The Roman calendar, November 1st. They changed the day from September 22nd to November 1st, and nobody really knows why. We can only speculate, and this is where the theories come in. The Celtic peoples, when they finally wrote the Druids' history, did not write September 22nd as the day that the vigil of Samhain is going to occur. They wrote, instead, November 1st. And the reason that they did this is open to scholarly speculation. Notice, however, that when the Christians began celebrating on November 1st, All Saints' Day, there were no Druids to copy. They had been extinct for 237 years, the Druids had. Furthermore, they couldn't copy the Celtic history of the Druids because it wouldn't be written for another 463 years. There was no history for them to copy. "463 years from the time that the church began celebrating a November 1st All Saints' Day until the time that they changed the Druids' vigil of Samhain from September 22nd to November 1st. And when they finally wrote about a November 1st Samhain, the Christian All Saints' Day had already been celebrated among the Celts who were becoming Christians for 150 years. They had been celebrating our day for 150 years in these environs. So when they changed to November 1st, it would suggest that the reason that they changed it to November 1st had something to do with our Halloween, which was already there 150 years ago. You see how this works? 150 years from the time Christianity comes to the Celts to the time that they wrote their history of the Druids. Finally, it's painfully clear that the Celts copied their fantasy of the Druidic Samhain from the Christian Halloween and not the other way around. They fashioned it purposely so that they could claim that the church must have copied them rather than the other way around, because it had been celebrated among them for 150 years before they got the idea of altering their own celebration so that it would appear older. And we were the ones that started all of this. Okay, these are the high points that we know about in the Vigil of Samhain that is now celebrated in the British Isles and from the Druidic history that was written. We know that it was originally celebrated on September 22nd, the autumnal equinox of the sun. We know that it was celebrated as a testament to their god of war, Samui. They burned prisoners of war alive in big baskets during this celebration. They think, we don't know for sure that this happened, but they think that this probably did happen. And they relit household fires. And just to explain that, they didn't have stoves with burners that you could turn on and light your matches, and they didn't have matches, and they didn't have lighters or propane or any of that good stuff back then. What they did was they had a big bonfire in the middle of the town, and they tried to keep this burning 24/7. If you had a similar bonfire in your house, in the grate, in the fireplace here, you'd try to keep it going continuously. This is your source of fire. If you wanted to cook something, you'd build the fire up and cook it right in there in the fireplace, and then eat it someplace else. But then you'd let the fire die down, but you wouldn't let it go out. If it went out by accident, you could relight it from the big bonfire in the center of town. That's where the town square got started. Lots and lots of cultures did this. It wasn't unique to the Celts. But what they all did that was kind of unique, specializing this Samui festival, is they purposely extinguished all of their household fires. They let their fires go out in their fireplaces and in their stoves. And then on the vigil of Samui, on that day, they would go out to the big bonfire in town and grab a piece of wood and light it on fire and bring it back to their house. Sometimes, I imagine, you had to go back and forth because it would go out as you were, you've done this before yourself, I'm sure. And relight your fire in your grate in your home. So all household fires then were extinguished and relit. It was part of the ceremony. Now, the reason we know about these things isn't because of the Celts writing it down. It's because of the Roman soldiers who were moving in. They observed these things and wrote them down in Roman history. So these things come to us from the Romans, their enemies, rather than from the Celts, or let alone from the Druids. So these are the hallmarks of the Vigil of Samui. Now, there is another theory. That's the theory of the Druids. Remember, the theory is, where did the Christians get their symbols? Where did they get trick or treat? Where did they get costumes? Where did they get giving to the poor? Where did they get all of these things that we do at Halloween today? Where did they think up these things? They probably got them from somebody else. Well, there is a third theory, and this third theory does not come to us from secular history. It comes to us from Scripture. And nobody ever hears about this. And this is absolutely incredible. You got to see this to appreciate it. This comes from the Bible. Now, I'm gonna talk to you here about a holiday that the Jews still celebrate today. In fact, in the Bible, it tells us, in the book of Esther, in the Old Testament, it tells us that in order to be a Jew, listen now, in order to be a Jew, you must celebrate this holiday every year. And you must celebrate it according to the scriptural definition and symbols of this thing. This is stunning. It's a Jewish holiday called Purim. Say it, Purim. The I am on the end of a Hebrew word is a way to make it plural. The word pur, P-U-R, means lot, not the guy Lot, but think of a dice. When you throw the dice, you don't throw the die, right? That's singular. You throw the dice, which is plural. You're throwing two or more dice. The same thing is true of lots. When you cast lots into your lap or something like that, they didn't have dice way back then. When you cast lots into your lap, what you're doing is casting more than one lot. And the story of Purim is recounted in the book of Esther in our Old Testament. It's long-winded. It goes on for 4 chapters, and they tend to be very complex telling of the story. So I'm going to read to you the Miglat of Esther. This is a Jewish version, a paraphrase of the story. They read this by necessity, by law. They read this to all people, all Jews celebrating this every year at Purim. Purim, by the way, is celebrated in the Jewish month of Adar, which corresponds to our May, on the 13th and 14th days of the month. Are you paying attention? Ooh. They celebrate Purim with the following story. By the way, there are good people in this story and there are bad people in this story. And the Bible says you must blot out the name of the bad people. And so the Jews, from a time almost 600 years before Jesus was born, have been booing and hissing and making noise. They bring noisemakers with them to synagogue to hear this story. And they watch the mouth of the cantor and of the rabbi. And when he's about to say the name of one of the bad guys, they make all the racket that they can to blot out his name. That's what it says to do in the Bible. You blot out his name. So they boo and they hiss, and they've got a thing called a gragger. Gragger is a Hebrew name for a noisemaker that you whirl. You may have seen these before. You whirl this around your head. I used to have one that burned up in a fire. And you whirl it around your head, and it makes a terrible racket. And nobody can hear what the rabbi or the cantor is saying because of all of the racket that all of the people in the cheap seats are making. And they're doing this because it's important to blot out the bad guy's name. What do you think they do when one of the good guys is mentioned? Yay! And they cheer, and you know, they've been doing this since a time 600 years before Jesus was born. And they do it on the 13th and the 14th of May, Adar. Now, this is just the beginning. This is huge. Listen to the story. In the 3rd year of his reign, King Ahasuerus, you try to boo and hiss. Put yourself in the cheap seats in the synagogue. You've got your gregors. Cheer and boo, okay? I'll give you a heads up. The bad guy's name is Haman. Haman, okay? You're going to boo and blot out his name. When you hear about one of the good guys are either Esther or Mordecai. Esther and Mordecai are the good guys in the story. You cheer them, okay? Ready? Okay. In the 3rd year of his reign, King Ahasuerus wanted to display his great wealth and to solidify his power, and he decided to have a feast. Simultaneously, Queen Vashti initiated a celebration for the women of the realm. On the 7th day of the festivities, the king, having had too much to drink, summoned Vashti and ordered her to appear and demonstrate her beauty for the king's officials. Now, according to some Midrash traditions, this meant disrobing and showing herself naked to all of the people at the feast, kind of. But that's not part of the story. So just a side thing there. Vashti was horrified and refused, as you can imagine. And the king had her executed. Poof. We'll just take care of this little female rebellion going on here. Had her executed. After some time, the king, desiring a new queen, followed his servant's advice and initiated a contest among all eligible girls in his kingdom. One of those brought to Shushan, the capital, was Esther, a Jewish girl raised by her relative Mordecai after her parents' death. Mordecai instructed Esther not to reveal her Jewishness. The contest was held, and Esther was chosen to be the new queen. I tried to zip past it there. You can imagine the fun that they have with this in the synagogues. This is they will. I've heard the cantors do this thing where they're running right up, because everybody has heard this story every year since they were kids. And so he'll be running right up to where everybody knows Mordecai is, and he'll say, or Haman, and he'll say, the Jewish girl whose name was Bob, They'll do this, you know, and people will say yay because they knew that Esther was supposed to be there, and so he'll say, no, we got to start over. So they start the story all over again until everybody gets it right. It's like Simon Says. Okay, after some time, the king, desiring a new queen, followed his servant's advice and initiated a contest among the eligible girls of the kingdom. One of those brought to Shushan, the capital, was Esther, a Jewish girl raised by her relative Mordecai after her parents' death. Now, Mordecai instructed Esther not to reveal her Jewishness. The contest was held, and Esther was chosen to be the new queen in Vashti's place. After a number of years, the king elevated Haman, a descendant of Amalek, the traditional enemy of the Jews, to a position above all other officials. So this guy, if you've ever seen the Disney version of the Arabian Nights thing, what's it called? Aladdin. Okay. This is a take on the biblical story of Esther. Aladdin is no. And of course, what's the princess's name?
Jasmine.
Okay, Jasmine. Okay, so this is Aladdin is a remake of this story. They paraphrased quite a bit. It's almost unrecognizable, but you get the general idea. So Haman commanded respect, and all bowed down to him except Mordecai, who refused to bow down because, according to the Midrash, Haman wore an idol around his neck. Not content to merely punish Mordecai, Haman wanted to destroy the entire Jewish people. You missed it, didn't you? He wanted to destroy the entire Jewish people, and he cast lots to determine the day of annihilation. Remember, one lot would be Pur, and more than one would be Purim, lots. See how that works? That's why they call the day Purim. To determine the day of annihilation. Haman went to the king, slandered the Jews, and received permission to do as he wished. Mordecai sent word of what was to happen to Esther, who is in the palace, of course, who, at risk to her own life, agreed to approach the king unsolicited on the subject. Now, I've got to add a couple things to this. First of all, when a proclamation is made by a Persian king, it's absolute. Even he cannot retract it. So once it's proclaimed, it's law. It's going to happen. There is no way to take it back. That's the first thing you should know. The second thing you know is that when somebody walks into the king's throne room to speak with him unsolicited, they will be summarily taken by the guards and beheaded. Doesn't matter who it is, even the queen will be beheaded immediately for such an offense by Persian law, unless the king raises his scepter. And that will wave the guards off and allow that person to come forward and speak. So Esther was somewhat concerned. She agreed to approach the king unsolicited on the subject. A 3-day fast was proclaimed among the Jews to seek God's help in the matter. Esther, this is a pitiful group, then interrupted the king, who gave her audience, raised his scepter. She invited the king and Haman to a banquet. The king and that guy, they were going to attend a banquet put on by Queen Esther. Now remember, nobody knew that secretly Esther was a Jewess. She invited Haman and the king to a banquet she would have. The king agreed, and Haman left the palace consumed with self-importance and pride. But these things were transformed into anger when he saw Mordecai. Haman went home and his wife Zeresh, and you don't have to boo and hiss, but she's a bad one too. His wife Zeresh advised him to construct a gallows 50 cubits high. That's roughly 75 feet. So the gallows for hanging people. Okay, he was going to build these gallows 75 feet high, upon which to hang Mordecai, because he hated Mordecai. Haman joyously acted upon. This was what his wife told him to do, and he joyously acted upon the suggestion. That night, the king could not sleep. Consequently, he ordered his servants to read aloud from the book of Chronicles, whereupon Ahasuerus discovered that a certain Jew by the name of Mordecai had never been rewarded for saving him from an assassination plot by two servants. Suddenly, Haman appeared in court. Boy, you guys are slow off the mark, aren't you? He appeared in the court to ask the king's permission to hang Mordecai. Pitiful. But before he could broach the subject, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king wishes to reward? Thinking of himself. Okay, this is what Haman was thinking about himself. What should be done for the man that the king wishes to reward? Haman, believing that Ahasuerus intended to reward him, replied that the honoree should be dressed in royal clothing and ride upon the royal horse, and to be led through the city streets by a government official, proclaiming, this is what is done to the man that the king wishes to honor. Ahasuerus agreed and instructed Haman to carry it out for Mordecai. Haman was furious. Haman followed the king's orders, heaping insult upon injury. Haman's daughter, assuming that it was Mordecai, assuming that it was that guy leading the horse, and assuming that it was her father that was on the back of the horse, dressed in the royal robes, because she couldn't see their faces, assuming that the guy leading the horse was Mordecai, she dumped a bedpan on the guy leading the horse, which was her father, Haman. He then happily attended the queen's banquet, where she asked the king to grant me my soul and my people. Now the king was confused. What do you mean you want me to grant you your soul and your people? And then Esther revealed both her Jewishness for the first time and Haman's villainous plot. Consumed with anger, Ahasuerus ordered Haman to be hanged on the gallows, to be hanged on his own gallows, which were intended for Mordecai. Now the king could not change any law that he had already sealed, so they elevated Mordecai to a position of great influence and allowed him to issue edicts permitting the Jews to fight and kill their enemies on the day before they could harm the Jews. They'd cast lots for the day. That was going to be on the 14th month, the 14th day of Adar. On the 13th day of Adar, the Jews, by proclamation of the king, were going to be able to find everybody that was upset with them and wipe them out. So there wouldn't be anybody left to take revenge on the Jews on the 14th. He couldn't retract, so he added to it. Many, upon hearing the news, listen now, many Jews and many people in the kingdom, upon hearing the news, quickly converted to Judaism to escape the Jews' wrath. On the 13th of Adar, as well as on the 14th in Shushan, the Jews won tremendous victories and were saved from the threat of total annihilation. A lot of people became Jews that day because they were afraid of retribution. Does that sound familiar? So Purim was established right about 500 BC, a little before that, for Adar 13th and 14th. And this is all in Scripture. All of this is in Scripture. You can read it for yourself in the book of Esther in the Old Testament. Now, the fun thing about this is the summary. Listen while I read this. The Jews faced worldwide annihilation. The new queen was secretly one of them. Rising to power, the secret was dramatically revealed. The Holocaust was reversed in a single proclamation. The oppressed came to rule over their oppressors. There was great rejoicing and giving to the poor. You find that out in the late last chapter. They decided to give to the poor, to rejoice, to celebrate this. Many became Jews for fear of reprisals, and a memorial day was instituted called Purim. Now, if that sounds familiar, it should. It's the exact same thing that constituted the origin of what we call Halloween today. This is 539 years before the first Druid was seen anywhere in the world by anyone. Interestingly, no one ever suggests that the Druids copied the biblical Purim. Isn't that interesting? Because they had been doing things, the Jews had been doing these things 539 years before the first Druid was ever seen. Now, this comes from a book called The Jewish Holidays, written by Rabbi Strasfeld, good Jewish rabbi. Observant Jews, he's explaining for the layperson the purpose behind Purim. Observant Jews celebrate the festival of Purim beginning on the evening preceding the 14th by dressing their children up in costumes of heroes and of the enemies in the story of Esther. Many of the costumes are of those that died. It is common to see old Haman and his 10 sons, all with hangman's nooses around their necks. This is the way they died. So they would dress up in these death things as either the bad guys or as the good guys. And special pastries and treats are prepared to resemble Haman's hat, buttons, and even his ears, called a ruche de Haman. And these are the ears of Haman. And they're little sticky buns. They're sticky buns is what they are, and they're Haman's ears. And the kids eat these with glee. Kind of creepy, isn't it? These are eaten with grisly glee. The costume children are sent out with baskets of these ready-to-eat treats to be delivered to the doors of their most favored friends and relative, called Mishloa Manot, and to the poor as well. As each basket is delivered, the children receive a tip of edible treats. Trick or treat. Also from the Jewish holidays, for the Jew, now this is kind of weird, but this is all weird anyway. For the Jew, the laws and customs of Purim all stem from this story of triumph of good over evil. God is understood to have controlled and manipulated all the action. Perhaps this is the most important aspect of the holiday and its lessons, that the hidden hand of God is in all things. The grandeur of God's design becomes apparent when one considers the entire tale. The Jews have a requirement from their Mishnah, their Talmud, their commentary, if you will, on the Old Testament, that they are to drink heavily on this day. Drink alcohol like a fish. You are to drink And you are not to stop drinking until you can, as a person, you can no longer distinguish between the sentences, blessed is Mordecai and cursed is Haman. If you can distinguish between those two verses, you haven't had enough to drink yet. Yeah, I know. I was going to say, this is a day that Richard's going to need to know about. The day is celebrated with costumes, masquerades, plays, parodies, and the heavy consumption of liquor. All these activities are meant to make Purim a day when everything is topsy-turvy and a Mardi Gras spirit runs wild even through the most straight-laced sectors of the Jewish community. You can imagine those old conservative rabbis with the big hats and, out there dancing jigs and drunk to beat the band, but this is a requirement. They have to do this. Now, Mishlat Manot is, these are pictures now that I've pulled from various sources. These are Jewish pictures of Purim activities. This is a picture of costumes that are still being sold at the time of Purim, before the time of Purim, up to a month or 2 months in advance. You can go to a Jewish bookstore or a Jewish store, and they will have costumes on sale, just like they do for us a month or so before Halloween. But since most of us have never been to a Jewish bookstore, we've never seen this. We've never had occasion to wonder, why are they dressing up in costumes? Why are they dressing up in Halloween costumes in the spring? Remember, this is in the spring. This is May 13th and 14th. These are Haman's ears. See the little currants and peaches and apricots filling in the middle, like a little pie. This is a princess. This is a Queen Esther costume, and this is a King Ahasuerus costume. These are big deals. Dress your kids up in like a princess. Remember that? Happy Purim. This is the box that they deliver. They sell these in the stores. You can buy these things by the gross. And what you do is you put the ready-to-eat treats in this box and have your kids deliver it to your most favorite family and friends. Now, this is important to understanding the concept of trick or treat. If the law says I've got to deliver, let's take Richard, because he's a real good target here. So Richard's across the street. He lives across the street, and he knows that I'm sending my kids out to deliver treats to all of my favorite friends. And Richard gets bypassed in this. And he gets upset because he didn't get anything. He's one of my favorite friends. He should be. So why didn't I get anything from Steve Carl? Well, he has a chance to get back at me the next morning. And this is how this works. These, again, are pictures of masks for Purim. And these are pictures of, in the first case, a Gregor. That's the thing that I was telling you about that makes the noise, the racket that you make to drown out Haman's name. This is Hamenstassen. This is this triangle. Hamenstassen is actually varies a little bit between Haman's ears and the three-pointed hat that he was supposed to wear. So they're not quite clear on which is which. And the Abloyada hammer. This is has morphed into something that today we call the squeaky hammer. If you look at eBay or Amazon, especially in the springtime, you'll be able to buy these things in the case, by the case. There are big parades in Israel, especially in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, called Adloyada parades, and they celebrate Purim the day after all the merriment has ceased. So they're out there and they're still hungover or drunk, and they're having these great big parades through the city streets. There are vendors on the street corners selling food and different kinds of things, but one of the big things hanging on all of these carts is these little Adloyama hammers. And you've seen these before. They have kind of an accordion ends on the hammer. And if you hit the hammer on something, it squeaks real loud. Squeak, like a clown hammer. And the base of it, you blow and it's a whistle. So they can use that also as just in case somebody mentions Haman. You know, they can use it as a noisemaker too. So it's a dual purpose kind of thing. They buy these things from the street vendors so that they can run through the parade looking for people that are in the crowd along the parade and people who are maybe in the parade that they expected to get treats from and didn't, like Richard. So Richard goes and gets a hammer and seeks me out and bonks me on the head, sometimes several times, squeaking each time, in an effort to say, why didn't I get anything from you? And that's where we get trick or treat from. Trick or treat. Treat or trick, one of the two. Here's a picture of the Adloyata parade. This, I think, is back in the 80s. Maybe the 90s. These are Jewish girls dressed up in costumes of the maids of the queen, and they're accompanied by good Jewish boys wearing their talit and their kippahs and their hats and such. Here's King Ahasuerus, and behind him you can see Queen Esther over there with the lions on each side of the throne and so forth. Now this is a comparison chart. I've come to the end of the three alternative theories, but actually there are really only two significant theories. Halloween, as it stands today, is a combination of, it began on May 13th and 14th, costumes, door-to-door, trick-or-treat, gifts to the poor, the jack-o'-lantern, black cats, and bats. If you asked somebody, anybody out there, for a list of things that define Halloween, this is the common list. Maybe they don't know about May 13th and 14th as being the origination date, but the rest of these things would come up in conversation. If you look at the hallmarks of the Vigil of Samhain, you get September 22nd, God of War, burned prisoners, and relight their household fires. If you also look at the way that Purim would be described by a celebrating Jew, you would get Adar, 13th and 14th, costumes, door-to-door, trick-or-treat, and gifts to the poor. So we've got a match here, and it is not the Druids. But the interesting thing is that between the Christians and the Jews, there's another kind of bond there. The Christians, especially the first century Christians, were all about Jewishness. In fact, for the first 50-odd years of Christianity, there was no such thing as a Gentile Christian. All Christians were Jews. It wasn't until Acts 15 in our Bible, at about AD 50, where Gentiles were allowed to come into the church of Jesus Christ without first converting into Judaism. Now we have Gentiles in the church. And all of us are Gentiles. We're all here because of Acts 15. But the context of the early church was Judaism. They all celebrated Purim. It is naive to assume that they didn't know about these things. What struck them was that there's a dramatic similarity between Purim and what had just happened to them. That is, the worldwide annihilation threat and the people becoming Christians because they were concerned about reprisals, etc., etc. The Jews and the Christians celebrate in the spring, or celebrated originally in the spring. Same days of the month, 13th and 14th. They had a common heritage, a common history, a common Bible, and a common God. Memorial days were established for a worldwide persecution and a miraculous deliverance. None of these things have anything to do with the Druids, by the way. And finally, they simply took the celebration of Purim and changed the meanings of the symbols. Costumes changed and the purpose for them, as well as door-to-door and trick-or-treat. Now, a couple things on this list are not included in either the Samhain celebration or in the Purim celebration. Jack-o'-lanterns, black cats, and bats. How did those things get stuck in Halloween? And the answer has eluded teachers and scholars and scientists for centuries and centuries. Well, I've got a theory. Okay, it's my theory, and I'll pass it on to you. Keep in mind that this is a theory. I don't have any basis for this other than the little bit of research that I've been able to do on the subject. And I'll share that with you. First of all, jack-o'-lanterns, that thing that we call a jack-lantern, which is a pumpkin with a face carved in it and a candle inside to show through the face. This is kind of an interesting construct. First of all, it appears nowhere in history until we get to America. That's because pumpkins do not grow naturally anywhere in the world except North America. Did you know that? Nowhere in the world. They didn't occur in Israel. They didn't occur in Palestine. They didn't occur in Europe. But the story of the jack-o'-lantern precedes the advent of the pumpkin. It goes all the way back to old Europe, Middle Ages Europe, to a guy named Jack. That's where we get jack-o'-lantern, Jack's lantern. And that's done with apostrophes as a contraction, by the way. So that, once again, it's letters and stuff left out. It's Jack's lantern, for short. That's the way you and I would think about it, Jack's lantern. And it's not Jack, by the way. This is not a lantern fashioned after Jack. It's Jack's lantern. It's the lantern that he carried. And this is the way that it works. The origin of the jack-o'-lantern is found in a fanciful tale of a down-on-his-luck Irishman named Stingy Jack. According to an Irish legend, jack-o'-lanterns were named for a man called Jack who could not enter heaven because he was a miser and could not enter hell either because he had played jokes on the devil. According to the folk tale of Jack, he choked. He tricked the devil into paying for drinks at the local pub, and the devil was furious. 3 times he was tricked by Jack. So the devil stormed out of there. A couple years later, on All Saints' Day, Jack choked to death while eating a turnip. No pumpkins. He was eating a turnip, and he choked to death while eating this turnip. Well, still carrying his half-eaten turnip, he showed up at the gates of heaven, and they rejected him because he was a miser and he didn't go to church and do all of this stuff. So he marched to the gates of hell, and the devil was so angry when he saw Jack coming that he picked up a fiery coal from hellfire and threw it at him, and Jack, not knowing what to do, caught it in the half-eaten turnip. And then he was condemned to wander between heaven and hell until Judgment Day, carrying his half-eaten turnip with the coal from hellfire in it. And that's what this is. Because he had played jokes on the devil. The result, Jack had to walk the earth with his lantern until Judgment Day. Now, there's more to the story, but for the sake of time, I'll let you discover this on your own. The black cat is a really weird one. A lot of people say, well, the black cat is a familiar for witches. I've heard this a lot. The problem is that anything can be a familiar for a witch. They use horses and they use dogs and wolves and anything that they can get their hands on, they use that for. Why choose a black cat for Halloween? Why is a black cat associated with Halloween? The best solution I can consider, having done a lot of research on this, is that the cat in and of itself is a hero during this season of the year when the harvest has just been brought in. Now, when you bring in a wheat harvest or a barley harvest at the end of the year, you got to put it someplace. And so what you do is you take it into the barn before it starts raining. And that way it won't get spoiled or rotting. And when you do carry it into the barn, the ancient agricultural world had no defense against the mouse or the snake or the other critters that would get in there and eat the grain that you had stored in there. So the solution was the cat. You had a cat around and kept it hungry, and it would get all of these things and eat them. And so the cat was considered a hero at this time of the year, and so it became associated with the season, the harvest season, rather than with Halloween, which was celebrated at the same time. Similarly, the bat. The bat is kind of a hero of the season. Bats eat thousands of bugs every night, yet they remain one of the most misunderstood creatures in nature. A single bat of average weight will consume well over 1,400 mosquito-sized insects every night. Now, when you have when everything is organic, and you're working out in the fields all day long, and you're coming up to dusk, and the bats start flying around, and the bugs, you're trying to keep the bugs out of your eyes and your mouth and your nose. The bats come in, and everybody's glad that the bats are here. People try to make the whole bat into the vampire bat kind of a thing and make that part of Halloween. Vampire bats are native to Argentina in South America. They are not native to any other place in the world. You will not find vampire bats in even Transylvania. There's no such thing. They come from Argentina down south in South America. The popular fiction of a vampire turning into a bat, vis-a-vis Dracula, is no older than the late 1800s when the book Dracula was published for the first time. And that's the very first time anybody had ever heard of a vampire kind of a guy turning into a bat and vice versa. So it could not have been part of Halloween. It could not have been part of the harvest celebration. Bats were heroes of the harvest. Okay, now quickly, the dispute over Halloween, just for review purposes, is not over who or why Halloween was created. The who is the early church, and the why is as a Christian Memorial Day. That's a fact. Fact of history, no dispute. No dispute. The theories have to do with where they got their symbols from. That is, where the church got trick-or-treats and costumes and stuff like that. Either the Druids or the Jews. Now, there's a case that could be made that the Druids could have gotten whatever they had from the Jews too, because the Jews are the ones that did this kind of thing first. But what the Druids celebrated was not Halloween. What the Druids celebrated was the Vigil of Samhain, and it bear no resemblance in any way to what we celebrate as Halloween, back then or today. There are critics that say, well, you know what, I appreciate all of this. I believe the facts about history that you've given references on. But the reason that the church did its November 1st thing was to subvert the November 1st Vigil of Samhain of the Celts. That's clear to me. That's what I want to believe. Or the other way around. The church invented Halloween to dilute and subvert the Vigil of Samhain. Now, keep in mind that the church didn't even know about the Vigil of Samhain when it started its Halloween. But set that aside for just a minute. The facts are that today we celebrate Halloween on October 31st. It's on our calendars. Have you ever seen the Vigil of Samhain on a calendar for any day? No. So we won. If that was the case, which it's not, but if all of that was true, then we succeeded. The church succeeded. So that's not an argument against the origins of Halloween. On the other hand, there are some who say that the Celts moved the Vigil of Samhain to November 1st in order to dilute the Christian Memorial Day. The Vigil of Samhain is uncelebrated and unknown all over the world. The only people who know about it and celebrate it are a small little sect of people over in Ireland. It's not on our calendar. So if this was the case, they failed, right? The Celts failed to subvert Halloween because we still got Halloween and they don't have the Vigil of Samhain. So the conclusions that we can take from this is that we should be celebrating, as Christians, we should be celebrating Halloween as it was intended by the early church, the Memorial Day of the Christian church. Is it a celebration of death? You bet. And that's a good thing. The same way Memorial Day is a good thing. Costumes of the dead, tortured and mutilated, lions, princesses, demons, and witches too. That can't be honoring God. That's exactly what it is for, to remember those who gave up their lives willingly rather than recant the name of Jesus. They were thrown to the lions. There were Caesars and Roman soldiers involved, and demons and witches too. We don't surround ourselves with don't we surround ourselves with jack-o'-lanterns? Aren't there bats and black cats and darkness all around? Yeah, it's done at nighttime. There's darkness at nighttime that kind of happens. Is the faith of our fathers shown anywhere in Halloween? It's all about the faith of our fathers. That's the whole point of a Memorial Day. So the answer is yes. It's the Memorial Day of the Christian church. But do I risk unknowingly worshiping Satan? This is what people ask. After all of this, do I risk worshiping Satan by celebrating Halloween? Do I risk offending God? What about witches and Satanists who claim it's their day? You know, this is the biggest argument. What about them? They think Halloween October 31st is their day. I can't celebrate anything on that day. That's their day. Who made it their day? Do you know that the Satanic Bible, which is crafted after our own Bible, by the way, is about 110, 150 maybe years old? Our Bible, the Old Testament in particular, was first penned. The book of Job is the oldest one of those things, and then the Torah, the first 5 books in the Bible, was written by Moses, and that was 1500 BC. So it's been around for 3,500 years, not 150. So, yeah, you don't have to worry about the credential of the Satanists. If you think that a Satanist knows more about Halloween than Christians do, well, in some case you're right. We know more about God than they do. They are trying to subvert God, and they'll do everything that they can to do that. That's the whole point of Satanism. If it's not in the Bible, if Jesus didn't celebrate it, should I? This is another one. I got a lot of this. If it's not in the Bible, and I know Jesus didn't celebrate this stuff, so why should I celebrate it? I'm a Christian. I'm a follower of Jesus. If he didn't do it, I'm not going to do it. I want to challenge you with something here. The Bible says you cannot be a Jew unless you celebrate Purim. And then it goes on to talk about sending portions one to another and giving to the poor, and the whole costuming thing came about very quickly and so forth. There is a very real possibility that Jesus, at least as a boy, celebrated Purim by biblical decree. And if he did, he was celebrating the forerunner of Halloween in the spring, but in order to be a Jew, and he was crucified as the king of the Jews, wasn't he? A Jew among Jews, in the land of the Jews, whose disciples were all Jews, and it was very Jewish. Isn't it better and safer to celebrate the harvest? I can't believe some people that would celebrate the harvest. Now, I know what they're thinking. They're thinking, okay, the harvest is all of the souls that are being brought in. I've never yet been to a harvest party at a church where souls are brought into the church during that party. The harvest, as described in Scripture, has yet to come. It's not happening now. It's yet to come. It's in the future. It's a prophecy. So having a harvest party instead of celebrating the Memorial Day of the Christian Church is kind of a rough sell, a tough sell. And that brings us to the conclusion. This is Halloween, a Christian tradition worthy of defense. It's up to you to decide what Halloween is and what it isn't. But based on history, there are only three alternatives, and they have to do with the symbols and where the Christians got their symbols from. Let's close in prayer. I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you, O my soul. Rejoice, take joy, my King, in what you hear. Let it be a sweet, sweet sound in your ear. Amen.